In late 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something most Americans did not. The United States was heading into a global war for which it was dangerously unprepared. The realization did not arrive all at once, but it became unavoidable in the months surrounding Pearl Harbor. On paper, the United States looked powerful. Its economy was vast, its population large, its industrial potential unmatched. Yet Roosevelt saw past those numbers. He saw an army ranked far below European powers, equipped with outdated weapons and trained for a war that no longer existed. American forces were scattered, undermanned, and largely untested. Mobilization plans were incomplete. Production schedules lagged behind strategic needs. Even basic coordination between branches of the military was fragmented. The country had avoided direct involvement in the war for years, and that delay had a cost. Roosevelt had already tried to sound the alarm. Throughout 1940 and 1941, he pushed rearmament programs through Congress, expanded naval construction, and quietly prepared the nation for conflict. But political reality limited how far he could go. Isolationism remained powerful. Large segments of the public opposed intervention. Congress resisted full mobilization. Roosevelt could accelerate preparation, but he could not openly declare a war footing without provoking backlash. As a result, readiness advanced unevenly. Factories began to retool, but output remained insufficient. Training programs expanded, but experienced leadership was thin. Equipment shortages persisted. The machinery of war was starting to turn, but far too slowly. Pearl Harbor stripped away any remaining illusions. The attack did not just draw the United States into the war, it exposed the gap between ambition and capability. Roosevelt now faced a brutal truth. America had committed itself to a conflict that demanded speed, coordination, and scale it did not yet possess. The enemy was not only overseas, it was embedded in the system itself. Delays, bottlenecks, and outdated assumptions threatened to undermine the war effort before it could fully begin. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted. Meetings, once framed around preparation, became discussions of damage control. The question was no longer how to get ready, but how to avoid disaster while readiness was still being built. The Army lacked modern armor. The Navy faced shortages in escorts and trained crews. The Air Forces were expanding rapidly, but aircraft production struggled to meet demand. Supply chains were vulnerable. Logistics planning was incomplete. Roosevelt understood that failure would not come from a single defeat, but from accumulated weakness. What made the moment especially dangerous was timing. The United States entered the war while its enemies were already mobilized, experienced, and operating at full capacity. Germany had refined its war machine through years of combat. Japan had planned its expansion meticulously. America was starting from behind, under pressure with no margin for error. Roosevelt knew that mistakes made in the first year could not easily be undone. Lives, alliances, and credibility were at stake. Publicly, Roosevelt projected confidence. He spoke of resolve and inevitability. Privately, he pushed relentlessly to compress years of preparation into months. Emergency powers expanded federal control. Production targets were rewritten. Command structures were reorganized. Yet even as these measures accelerated, the gap remained. The war would not wait for America to catch up. This was the moment Roosevelt realized the true scale of the challenge. Victory was not guaranteed by resources alone. It depended on whether the United States could transform itself fast enough to survive the opening phase of a global war. The realization marked the beginning of the most intense period of internal pressure the American system had ever faced, and it would only grow worse before it got better. By early 1942, the consequences of American unpreparedness became impossible to ignore. Reports reaching the White House painted a disturbing picture. Units were deploying overseas without adequate training. Equipment shortages delayed operations. Commanders complained of confusion, duplication, and conflicting orders. The rapid expansion of the armed forces had created an army on paper, but not yet in reality. Soldiers arrived at bases faster than rifles, vehicles, or instructors. Air units received aircraft before ground crews were fully trained to maintain them. The Navy faced critical shortages of escort vessels, leaving vital shipping routes exposed. Roosevelt understood that these were not isolated problems. They were symptoms of a system stretched beyond its design limits. The pressure was especially intense in the Pacific. Japan's early victories exposed how thin American defenses were. The fall of the Philippines, the loss of Guam, and the desperate retreat from Southeast Asia revealed a lack of readiness that could not be concealed. Supplies failed to arrive on time, reinforcements were delayed. Coordination between Army and Navy commands faltered under combat conditions. Roosevelt received cables describing shortages of ammunition, fuel, and medical equipment. These were not future risks. They were present realities unfolding in real time. The United States was fighting while still building the machinery required to fight. In Europe, the situation was no less concerning. Britain depended heavily on American production to sustain its war effort, yet output targets remained behind schedule. Lend-Lease deliveries struggled against shipping losses and logistical bottlenecks. Roosevelt faced mounting pressure from Allied leaders who needed immediate support. At the same time, American commanders cautioned against premature commitments. The armed forces lacked the readiness for large-scale offensive operations. The dilemma was stark. Delay risked weakening alliances. Action risked exposing weakness. Internally, Roosevelt confronted resistance and friction. Rapid expansion strained every institution involved. Government agencies competed for authority. Military branches argued over priorities. Industry struggled to meet unrealistic deadlines. Labor shortages emerged as millions entered the armed forces. Training programs were rushed, sometimes dangerously so. Accidents increased, mistakes multiplied. The pace of mobilization left little room for correction. Roosevelt pushed for coordination, but coordination itself took time, the one resource he did not have. What troubled Roosevelt most was the realization that public confidence outpaced actual capability. The American people believed industrial strength alone would guarantee success. Roosevelt knew better. Industry could produce, but production required organization, transport, and protection. Ships needed escorts, factories needed raw materials, soldiers needed training. None of these could be accelerated infinitely. Every shortcut carried risk. The danger lay not in a single failure, but in cumulative strain overwhelming the system. By mid-1942, Roosevelt faced a grim calculation. The United States could not retreat from the war, but it could not yet fight it at full scale either. The country existed in a dangerous middle ground, committed but not ready. This vulnerability shaped every decision. Strategic caution was not weakness, it was necessity. Roosevelt resisted pressure for premature offensives, knowing that failure early in the war could be catastrophic. He authorized limited operations, while focusing relentlessly on building capacity. The war would be won later, or lost early. This phase of the conflict is easy to overlook because it produced few dramatic victories. It was defined by delay, frustration, and hard choices. Roosevelt bore the weight of those choices privately. Every report, every casualty list, every request for resources reinforced the same conclusion. America was racing against time, not just the enemy. The war would test whether the nation could transform itself faster than events overtook it. For Roosevelt, this realization was not theoretical, it was measured in weeks and months, and the margin for error was vanishing. Roosevelt responded to the growing crisis by forcing changes that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. He understood that incremental reform would not be enough. The existing system was too slow, too fragmented, and too cautious for the scale of the war now underway. In 1942, he began consolidating authority and streamlining decision-making at a pace that alarmed both political allies and critics. New agencies were empowered to override traditional bureaucratic boundaries. Military production priorities were centralized. Contracts were standardized. Civilian industry was reorganized around war needs rather than market logic. These moves were not driven by ideology, but by urgency. The war was already testing the limits of American readiness, and Roosevelt knew the margin for correction was shrinking rapidly. One of the most significant shifts came in the relationship between government and industry. Roosevelt pushed for unprecedented cooperation, backed by federal authority. Companies that had competed fiercely were now expected to coordinate output and share information. Production schedules were no longer negotiated. They were imposed. When bottlenecks appeared, resources were redirected immediately. Delays were treated as strategic risks. This approach accelerated output, but it also exposed new tensions. Labor disputes increased. Management struggled to meet targets set under pressure. Safety was sometimes compromised in the rush to deliver equipment. Roosevelt accepted these risks because the alternative was worse. The war could not be fought at half speed. At the same time, Roosevelt focused on command reform. He supported the creation of unified leadership structures that reduced inter-service rivalry. Clear lines of authority replaced overlapping responsibilities. Planning became more disciplined. The emphasis shifted from theoretical readiness to practical capability. Training programs were redesigned to reflect battlefield realities. Equipment standardization reduced confusion. Logistics planning received renewed attention, acknowledging that supply failures could undo any tactical success. These changes did not produce immediate results, but they altered the trajectory of the war effort. By late 1942, early signs of recovery began to appear. Production increased steadily. Aircraft deliveries rose. Shipyards accelerated output. Escort vessels entered service in growing numbers. Training pipelines improved. Losses continued, but they were no longer compounded by administrative paralysis. The system began to absorb shocks rather than amplify them. Roosevelt monitored these developments closely, aware that improvement did not guarantee safety. The enemy retained the initiative in many theaters, but the balance was shifting. What made this phase particularly dangerous was that progress could mask underlying fragility. Success bred confidence, and confidence risked overextension. Roosevelt remained cautious. He resisted calls for immediate large-scale offensives that would strain still maturing capabilities. He balanced Allied expectations against American readiness, aware that political pressure could push the system beyond sustainable limits. His leadership during this period was defined less by bold announcements than by restraint. He understood that survival required patience as much as resolve. This restraint was not always popular. Critics accused Roosevelt of moving too slowly. Allies demanded more immediate action. Military leaders debated priorities intensely. Yet Roosevelt's calculations were shaped by hard data rather than rhetoric. Production curves, training reports, and logistics assessments guided decisions more than optimism. The war effort was beginning to stabilize, but it was not yet secure. One misstep could still unravel months of progress. By the end of 1942, the United States was no longer completely unprepared, but it was not yet ready for the decisive phase of the war. Roosevelt had bought time through reorganization and control. The question was whether that time would be enough. The transformation underway was immense, but so were the demands ahead. The war would soon test whether America's forced adaptation could hold under sustained pressure. For Roosevelt, the realization that America was not ready had evolved into a more dangerous question. Could it become ready before the war demanded everything at once? By 1943, the consequences of Roosevelt's forced transformation were finally visible, but they came with a sobering realization. America had survived the most dangerous phase of the war not because it had been ready, but because it had adapted just fast enough. Production now surged at unprecedented levels. Shipyards launched vessels faster than enemy submarines could sink them. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines in numbers once considered impossible. Training pipelines stabilized. Logistics networks grew more resilient. Yet this success did not erase the vulnerability of the previous year. It reframed it. The margin between collapse and recovery had been far narrower than public memory would later admit. Roosevelt understood that the war's outcome was not the result of inevitable superiority, but of a system pushed to its limits without breaking. This understanding shaped how the rest of the war was fought. Roosevelt and his advisors approached major operations with a deeper awareness of systemic risk. Large offensives were no longer judged solely on tactical brilliance, but on whether the industrial and logistical base could sustain them. The lessons of early unpreparedness were embedded into planning. Redundancy replaced optimism. Supply chains were protected with the same urgency as front lines. Coordination between allies improved not out of idealism, but necessity. The war effort matured into something more disciplined, less fragile, and far less forgiving of error. What makes this period difficult to capture in popular history is that it lacks a single defining moment. There was no dramatic speech announcing readiness, no clear date when America became prepared. Instead, readiness emerged gradually, unevenly, through thousands of decisions made under pressure. Roosevelt's leadership during this phase was not about inspiration alone. It was about control, restraint, and acceptance of hard limits. He governed not as a wartime myth, but as a manager of risk in a system that could still fail. The significance of Roosevelt's realization lies in what it revealed about modern warfare. Industrial capacity did not guarantee immediate power. Time, coordination, and adaptation mattered just as much. Entering a global conflict late did not confer safety. It created vulnerability. The United States paid for years of delayed preparation in confusion, loss, and near failure during the war's opening phase. That cost was absorbed quietly, without ceremony, but it was real. After the war, the narrative shifted. America's victory was framed as the natural outcome of its size and strength. The uncomfortable truth faded. The nation had not been ready. It had been fortunate enough to survive long enough to become ready. Roosevelt's private concern, his awareness of systemic weakness, was replaced by a public story of inevitability. That story simplified history, but it also obscured its most important lesson. The early years of World War II demonstrate that power is not static. It must be organized, protected, and aligned with reality. Roosevelt's realization forced the United States to confront its own limitations at the worst possible moment. That confrontation nearly broke the system, but it also forged it into something capable of sustaining a global war. The transformation came at immense cost and under relentless pressure. It succeeded because adaptation outran catastrophe, not because catastrophe was impossible. This is why the moment Roosevelt realized America was not ready matters more than moments of triumph. It was a moment of clarity, not confidence. It stripped away illusion and replaced it with urgency. The war was not won when America entered it. It was won later, after survival had already been negotiated through failure, correction, and restraint. History remembers victory. It rarely remembers how close that victory came to slipping away. The true legacy of this realization is not found in monuments or speeches. It lies in the understanding that modern wars are not decided by intention alone. They are decided by systems under stress, and by leaders who recognize weakness before it becomes fatal. Roosevelt did not inherit readiness. He was forced to build it while the war was already underway, and for a brief, dangerous period, the outcome remained very much in doubt.